One thing that we all have in common is that we only have one go-around in this world. We only have one life to live here on this earth. And so for those of us who love the Lord and want to walk with Him, and really I think this is true for most people, you want your life to make a difference. You want to have an impact. You want to live a life of significance. There aren't too many people who want to get to the end of the road and look back on their life and say, what a waste. Boy, I didn't do anything. I didn't accomplish anything. I didn't touch anybody's life. I didn't make a difference. What a waste of time all those years were here in this world. We don't want to get to that point, do we? And so it's good for us to step back every once in a while and look about how we can make a significant difference in this world. I believe that God wants every one of us to live a life of significance. And when I talk about significance, I'm talking about making a difference in people's lives, making an impact, touching other people's lives, helping other people to live better lives, doing what we can to really make an impact in this world. And we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because there is a passage here at the end of that chapter where Paul really gives us some principles on how we can live a life that isn't wasted, that to live a life that really makes a difference. And so we're going to read verses 24 through verse 27 in the NIV. Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." I'm sure you know that Steve Jobs was one of the co-founders of Apple Computers. And one day he was meeting with a man by the name of John Sculley. Now, John Sculley was the chairman of Pepsi Corporation. He worked for Pepsi Corporation as a chairman, and Steve Jobs was trying to get him to leave Pepsi and to come over to Apple Computers to be the CEO. But as they talked, John Sculley said that he wasn't interested, that he was quite satisfied with his job at Pepsi. And Steve Jobs kept trying to talk him into it and just wasn't getting anywhere, until finally, in exasperation, Steve Jobs looked John Sculley in the eye and he said to him, "Do you mean to tell me that you would rather sell sugared water for the rest of your life when you can lead a company that's going to change the world?" Well, that convinced John Sculley, and he left Pepsi and went to be the CEO of Apple Computers. So Steve Jobs reached into his heart and touched a chord called significance. I think that there is something in human nature that leads us to long for significance, to make a difference. In fact, it seems like the root of much depression and despair in the lives of some people is this sense of meaninglessness. You know, this idea of my life doesn't matter, I'm not making a difference, I have no purpose, what's the point? And so a lot of people get depressed and sometimes even give up altogether because they lose a sense, or maybe never find a sense of significance. And somebody observed one time that there are two great days in a person's life: the day you were born and the day you discover why you were born. Unfortunately, a lot of people never get to the why. They never figure out why they were born. Or, if they do, perhaps they just don't have the drive, or they don't have the sense of discipline, or they just don't apply themselves to really pursuing the why. They may know their purpose, but they just don't have it within them, or they're just slothful or lethargic or indifferent, and they just don't pursue their purpose and end up not making a difference, even if they know why God put them here in this world. Well, I want us to look at this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I want to give you 3 words. All of them start with the letter D, that Paul had in his life that helped him to live a life of significance. I don't think there's anyone here that would question whether or not Paul, the apostle, lived a life of significance. My goodness, his influence continues to this day. And so let's look at these 3 words. The first word is the word drive. The word drive. The apostle Paul certainly was a man that had a lot of drive in him. I'm talking about this compulsion, this feeling compelled to work, to serve, to minister, this inner drive, this passion, this fire in his belly that just compelled him to serve and to do for the Lord. Nobody would question that, right? That Paul was a man that had tremendous drive. It was that drive that led him to write in Philippians chapter 3, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Paul was a man who had a tremendous amount of drive. I mean, he was driven to do the things that he did. And it's a sad thing when you stop and think about it, when you see somebody that maybe has a great giftedness, they have some ability and talent, but they just don't have the drive, and they're just kind of lazy. You're kind of like the guy who got to work one day and his boss asked him, he said, how long does it take you to get to work in the morning? And the guy said, oh, I don't know, probably about an hour after I get here, I suppose. There's a man that just lacks drive, right? Just not a self-starter. And we need drive to do the things that God calls us to do. About 20 years ago, I read a book by Chuck Swindoll called Living Above the Level of Mediocrity. And in that book, he said, long enough has mediocrity called our cadence. Long enough have we taken our cues from those who say, let's do just enough to get by. Long enough have we given less than our best. And then he said, call me a dreamer, but I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe that living up to one's full potential is still a goal worth striving for. That excellence is still worth pursuing. And I think he's right on with that. And we ought to strive to live up to our potential. We ought to not listen to those voices out there who say, oh, just do enough to get by. Nobody's really going to care anyway. Just slide by. That's all that matters. We need to quit listening to voices like that and do the very best we can for the glory of God. Now, what you might be thinking when I say that, though, is, it all sounds well and good and everything, but I just don't have that drive. Some of you are probably type A personalities. I think that's probably not the majority of people in the world. But for those of you who are type A personalities, you just make the rest of us sick. Let me just go ahead and lay that out there. You just really get on our nerves. But no, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. Actually, we admire you. You wake up and you've accomplished so much in the morning while everybody else is still wiping the sleep out of their eyes. You know what I'm talking about? And there are just some who are just type A personalities, just always on the go, always driven. And that's great. We need people like that in the world. It seems that the majority of people aren't. So the question then comes, what do you do about it? What if you're not just naturally driven to accomplish things? How do I motivate myself? How do I get this drive like Paul had, who said, I press toward the mark? And in verse 24, he said, he said, everyone that runs in a race, they all run, but only one receives the prize. And he said, run in such a way that you win. And how do I get that drive? How do I get motivated? Well, let me say this. I think a lot of our problem comes from the fact that we misunderstand motivation. I think so often we kind of sit around waiting for motivation to come to us. Like there's some cloud in the sky with this liquid called motivation, and it's just going to someday overflow and start raining on us, and then, okay, well, we got it, now I'm ready to go. But motivation doesn't work like that. Motivation is not going to strike you like lightning while you're sitting in your eating easy chair watching television eating potato chips, okay? It's just not going to come that way. That's not how motivation works. Motivation is more like a byproduct. Kind of like happiness and love. It results from what you do. That's what motivation really is. That you get engaged in something, you get involved in something, and then the motivation is more likely to come. It comes that way. There was a psychologist named Jerome Bruner, and he said, you're more likely to act yourself into feeling than you are to feel yourself into action. In other words, he said you're more likely to get involved in a task and then get this feeling of motivation. You're more likely to do that than sit around saying, okay, God, if you really want me to do this, you'll motivate me. You're more likely to do the other than to wait around and get all of a sudden motivated to get involved in something. You're better off just getting involved and then hoping the motivation comes along. It's more likely to happen that way. You know, John Maxwell, in one of his books, differentiated between laggers and leaders. You know, a lagger being like one who lags behind, okay? And he said a lagger, one who lags behind, those people feel good and then they do it. But a leader does it and then they feel good. In other words, a person who lags behind just kind of sits around waiting to feel good, waiting for the motivation, waiting for something to strike them. And then they'll do it. Whatever it is, the task, the job, the project. And the problem is, a lot of times the motivation isn't going to hit them. And so they lag behind. But he said a leader now, someone who's going to get things done, just does it. And then the feel-good feeling will come, the motivation will come. There was a columnist named Sidney Harris who was giving a lecture one time before a group of up-and-coming writers. And at the end of that session, he had a question and answer time. And somebody asked him, he said, well, Mr. Harris, what do you do when you just don't feel like writing? You know what he said? He said, I write. And he said, that's what differentiates the professionals from the amateurs. Is I just start writing. And that's where we're more likely to get motivated. Now, let me just say, this doesn't apply to everything. You know, you could take me to a fabric store every day for a month. I say that because that's one of my worst memories growing up. My grandmother was a seamstress. And so, you know, we'd be out, I was 8 years old, 10 years old. Oh, let's stop by Joann's Fabrics. Like, can't we just jump off a cliff? You know? And so you can take me there every day for a month, and I'm not going to get motivated, probably. And you know, some of you who hate sports, you could probably watch football or basketball every day for a month, and you maybe would never love it, you know. I'm not talking about that so much, but when I say you need to get involved and then the motivation will come, it has to be something that is in your wheelhouse, something that you know is important, something that's going to make a difference. You know, you could sit around for years and say, you know, it really would be nice if I felt motivated to, I don't know, work at a shelter, feed the homeless, teach Sunday school, or whatever. You say, it'd be nice if I felt like doing it, but I just don't. Do you know what? If you started doing it and you saw the difference you were making in people's lives, then that motivation might come. Like, wow, this is awesome. These people really appreciate it. These people really need this. And I need to give like this of my time. That's what I'm talking about, things that make a difference. You should start doing it. And then that motivation is more likely to follow. But if you just sit around all day long and say, well, you know, I really hope to do something for God if He ever motivates me, like it's His fault, you know, then most likely that motivation isn't going to hit you. You just got to get involved, start doing something. So drive is the first thing. We need to drive. Paul had that drive. He said, run in such a way that you win. The second word is the word direction. Direction. In verse 26, Paul said that I don't just run aimlessly. He said, I don't fight like somebody beating the air. It's just throwing their punches around. He said, I have a purpose. I run in a way that's going to accomplish something. So he said, I don't just run about aimlessly. I have direction. You see, it's not enough just to have drive. If you want your life to be useful and make a difference in the kingdom and make a difference in the lives of other people, it's not enough just to have drive. You also have to have direction. In other words, you need to harness that drive in a positive way. I mean, let's think about this. There have been a lot of ruthless, tyrannical rulers in this world who have been very driven. In fact, some of them are the most driven people in history. But a lot of them didn't have good, positive, godly direction, especially the ruthless ones, that kill and maim and cause wars. I mean, they have a great drive, admirable drive. I mean, they're just driven people. But if it's not directed, then they're going to do more harm than good. And so it's not just drive that we need, but we need to direct that then toward God's purposes. But without direction, then our drive isn't going to go anywhere. Or it might be directed toward things that are trivial. I mean, we can all direct ourselves toward trivial things and give ourselves to things that don't really matter. You might have a great drive to count how many cars drive by your house next week. But that's not very good direction, because who cares? It just doesn't accomplish anything. So you have to have direction. There's a scene in Alice in Wonderland where Alice is talking to the Cheshire Cat. And Alice says to the cat, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And the Cheshire Cat says, "Well, it depends a good deal on where you want to go to." And then Alice says, "Well, I don't much care where." To which the cat replies, "Then it doesn't matter which way you go." I always found that a little intriguing. She wants to go somewhere, but she doesn't know where, and the cat says, "Well, it really doesn't matter which way you go." If you really don't care about making much of your life, it really doesn't matter which way you go. But I think you care. You first of all want to glorify God in your life, you know Jesus as your Savior. And then you don't just want to be content with sliding by. You want to make a difference in this world. And so you need direction. And if you don't have a direction, if you don't have some plan, some goal, some ministry, some task, something that you do to make a difference, and you're going to be just like a ship at sea with no sail or no rudder, and you're just going to drift about aimlessly at the mercy of the winds and the waves, and you're not going to have any idea where you're going to end up or what you're going to accomplish. And so it's very important to step back and get some direction. Now, this is the tricky part, because it's going to be different for every one of us. You see, there is a sense in which God's will is the same for everybody, in that He's called us all to be Christians. He's called us all to honor Him, glorify Him, live righteous life in this world and so forth, love one another and all that. But there's also a sense in which God's will for each of us is very different. In other words, He doesn't call us all to do the same things, because He gives us different gifts. He gives us different abilities and talents, different passions in our hearts. And so He gives us all different things to do. So what I would suggest in trying to seek direction is to take some time. It might be an hour, it might be 2 hours, it might be a morning, it might be some blocks of time over a week. But take some time and just get alone with God. And just pour your own heart out to God and say, "Lord, I only have one life to live. And I want to use it for you, and I want to make a difference in people's life. I want to make people's lives better. I want to enrich their lives. I want to lift up the kingdom. What would you have me to do?" You might want to have a pad and paper, a pencil there to jot down some thoughts that come to your mind. Maybe some abilities He's given you, or some concerns that He's given you that are important to you. And you might want to jot some of those down. Others of you who aren't the writing kind of person, you might want to just see it in your mind's eye, whatever it might be, however it is you work. But see what God would have you to do. And it's going to be different for everybody. I mean, some people are real logical thinkers, number cruncher type of people, administrative type people. Then other people are very creative. The idea of balancing a checkbook drives these other people crazy. It's like, how in the world do you do that? It just gives me a headache. But then other people are very creative. They can make things and draw things. If you wanted me to draw you something, I can just do stick figures, And that's about it. But don't laugh too much because, I can balance a checkbook, okay? I'm one of the 3%. Now I'm kidding because so much is automated these days. But everybody's gifts is different, all right? We all have different abilities. Some of you might work better in front of a crowd. Others might work better as a leader. And others of you might say, I don't want that spotlight. I'd rather be a follower. I could be glad to be on a team that could work with somebody in something. And so don't feel like you have to follow somebody else's path. But what is your niche? What has God called you to do? And I know this can be tough, and it can be a process, and it might take weeks or maybe even a few months for you to nail it down. Maybe you already know. Maybe you're involved in it right now. But I would encourage you to take some time and just pray to God and say, what do you want me to do? God might give you a new vision of how you can make other people's lives better, how you can touch other people, how you can spread the word of Jesus in a new way. He might have you start writing letters to people in the church or letters to missionaries or in some other way, touch people. People, letter writing is an old-fashioned art going out of style, but it still is meaningful when you get a handwritten letter from somebody. Others of you saying, I wouldn't want to write a letter. It was the last thing in the world. I just can't discipline myself to sit down and do that. But for you, it might be something else. It might be leading a ministry. It might be sharing God's love in some other way. But I just want to encourage you to take some time and explore. God, what do you want me to do? I don't just want to coast through this life without giving this thought. But I really want to sit down there. What do you want me to do? So look for direction. I can't stand here and tell you what it is because it's different for everybody. And so we've got to continually explore that in our lives. So we need drive that Paul had, the direction Paul had, and the third D that he had was a discipline. Okay, nobody got up and walked out. That's a good thing. Because I just said a really bad word just now. Discipline. That's the one we think. Okay, do we have to talk about discipline? That's a tough one. But again, you can have drive. And you can feel very motivated and very passionate about something. And you can even have direction. But if you don't have discipline, you might as well just hang it up. Or, better idea, start disciplining yourself now so that you do these things that we're talking about. See what Paul said in verses 25 and 27. He said that those who train for the games, they did have games back in those days, even ancient Olympic games. And he said they put themselves into strict training. And then in verse 27, he said, I treat my body like a slave. In other words, I do whatever I need to do to get myself in shape to do what God's called me to do. It takes discipline. That's what Paul's talking about. He's saying God's called me to do certain things. And I'm going to discipline myself to do them. And I know this is a challenge. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend like I got this all mastered. Because I struggle with discipline too, just like probably most people. But certainly it's something we need to continue to pursue and continue to try our very best to perfect the best we can. But have you ever noticed that you never have to discipline yourself to do things you enjoy? Right? Things that are easy. I never have to discipline myself to drink a Pepsi. Never do. I don't have to say to myself that when lunchtime rolls around, now William, if you really hunker down here and really discipline yourself, you can handle this, Because that's something I like. In fact, it calls my name. It's just easy, right? Because I don't have to do anything. I don't have to discipline myself if something's easy. It's something you want to do. It's the hard things, right, that you have to discipline yourself to do. It's the unpleasant tasks or the things that seem like a chore or that require at least a little bit of energy. For example, for me personally, I've always felt very much the importance of reading. But I have to continually discipline myself to read. I found out this morning that Gene Shook can read a book in a day. And Norma Goodman just flies through them. Berta Jean was bringing back some books that she borrowed. Last night, she read them all. I'm just kidding. Norma did, And I just sit back like, how in the world do you do that, But let me tell you this. I've always valued reading, ever since, especially since I was called to be a pastor. And there are two reasons. One is for personal growth. I feel like I need to read for my own personal growth. To see what other people see, to learn from other people, because believe me, people know so much that I don't know. I know like this much compared to the rest. And so I learn from them, I grow. But the second reason I feel that reading is important is that as a pastor, I feel like it's very important. I think every pastor ought to be a reader because there's so much for us to learn concerning the church, concerning our own personal lives, that we need to continue to grow as a pastor, or else I think I'm robbing you as a congregation if I'm not reading and growing. But reading has never been something that's come naturally for me. I'm not one to just sit down and read 50 pages. I'm just not that way. I don't know why, but it's always been more of a chore for me. But I have to discipline myself to do it. And I'll be honest with you, I've been not as successful as I would like, but I try to set some goals to try to keep myself positioned to where I do read. But yeah, that's one of the things I'm giving you an example. That to me, that's difficult. For some of you, that's easy. But that's an area where I have to discipline myself. And for you, it might be a different area, disciplining yourself. But discipline's very, very important for us to do. But keep this in mind. Somebody said one time, I have learned much more from the things that I've had to do than from the things I chose to do. Oh, that's interesting. I've learned much more from what I've had to do from those things that I've chosen to do. And so there are a lot of things in this life we have to do. And we need to discipline ourselves to do them. Those are the areas that we'll probably experience our greatest growth. But still, how do we discipline ourselves? I want to give you this is a real tidbit of information I think it's very important on how to discipline ourselves to grow. It's very simple, but I think it's very important. In order to discipline yourself to do any task that you don't want to do, or that you find difficult, or is going to require energy, you need to have the big picture in mind. In other words, you can't just be thinking about what you're doing that day. You've got to think down the road. You have to think ahead. You've got to think of the future. I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of us don't take care of our bodies is because we're not thinking 20 years down the road. We're just thinking, I want that right now. I want that dessert. I want that hamburger, whatever it is. I want it now. We're not thinking 20 years down the road. Or why we don't exercise. We're not thinking 20 years down the road. We're thinking of today. And it's a challenge for most of us, to do that because it requires forward thinking. You've probably heard of the book Streams in the Desert. It's a classic devotional book by L.B. Cowman. And she has a tremendous quote. We're going to put it up there. And here's what she said. Look at this. The glory of tomorrow is rooted in the drudgery of today. Man, I love that quote. Because it's so true. The glory of tomorrow is rooted in the drudgery of today. In other words, tomorrow can be better because of the difficult things that you do today. If you resist buying something that you probably can't afford or might put you in a bind, but you resist that and you save the money, then that gives you a better tomorrow. Because of the drudgery of having to discipline yourself to say no today. Those things that you can say no to or the things you can discipline yourself to do today can make for a better tomorrow. The glory of tomorrow is rooted in the drudgery of today. So a lot of those things you have to discipline yourself to do that might be distasteful or require energy or just plain difficult or not something that you're really looking forward to do. And how many times, if you buckle down and do them, the next day or the next week or the next year, you're thinking, man, I'm so glad I did that. Who wants to get the oil changed in the car because it takes time? Right? You got to take time out of your schedule and take it somewhere and get it done or do it yourself. But if you don't do it, if you want to have a good running car, though, the glory of tomorrow is rooted in the drudgery of today, the unpleasant tasks. Even things like, with our children or our marriage. Sometimes we got to do things, not that they're unpleasant, but it requires discipline. It requires discipline to keep love alive in a marriage because you got to do things that you might not naturally think about doing. Or if it's a child, you got to go somewhere, perhaps to one of their outings that maybe you don't really feel like doing, but you're building relationships. You see, so the glory of tomorrow is rooted in the drudgery of today. The fact that you discipline yourself to build that relationship tomorrow results in a better relationship. You see, you got to discipline yourself. I have a number of quotations that really just 4 or 5, that I keep in my desk drawer, kind of to motivate me. And I actually have one. I came across it on Thursday. I really wasn't looking for it. I just happened to be in my desk drawer, and I saw that, and I thought, oh, that's perfect for my sermon. It's a quote from Muhammad Ali. Really, he said this. Listen to this. Because sometimes, there are things I don't want to do that I need to do to be prepared for things, okay? And he said this, and it really surprised me that he said this. He said, I hated every minute of training. Now, I'm not done with the quote, but when I read that, I thought, wow, Because, you think these guys, it just comes naturally and it's not difficult. But, sometimes when I don't feel like doing certain things, I remember that. Especially if it's prep work on something. And he said, I hated every minute of training. But I said, continuing the quote now, he said, I said to myself, don't quit, suffer now, and live the rest of your life like a champion. Man, that's a good quote. That inspires me when I read that. When there are certain things that I don't want to do to prepare for something, I'll read that. And he said, wow, I think Muhammad Ali hated every minute of training. But he said, don't quit and suffer now. And for the rest of your life, live as a champion. So he did the discipline stuff, all the hard work and training, and he became probably the greatest boxer the world's ever seen. So you got to keep the future in mind. If you want to discipline yourself, don't just look at the task and say, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. It's going to take energy. I don't feel like it today. Look at the future. What benefits is this going to reap down the road? I would even encourage you to write that quote down. If you didn't get it, you can get it after service. I want to close with this one story that Tony Campolo told. Tony Campolo is a professor in Philadelphia and an author, written a number of books, a very influential Christian leader. And he has attended, since he was a teenager, a predominantly black church in West Philadelphia called Mount Carmel Baptist Church. Now, he's a white man, but he attends this predominantly African-American church. And he tells this story about how that every year, like most churches, they recognize the graduates that they have on high school, college. And they'll have, it's a larger church, they'll have several first rows filled up with graduates that year. And one particular year, like they always do, they have the graduates come up and they'll tell what their plans are. And one guy comes up and says, I'm going to go to Harvard and study to be a lawyer. And the people, praise Jesus, and they're waving their hankies. It's just so fun in a black church. And the next one gets up and the guy says, I'm going to be studying engineering at MIT. And then a young lady says, I'm going to be studying music at Juilliard. And thank you, Lord, and they're just happy. And finally, they all get done. And the preacher gets up, he's a big black man with a strong voice, all right? And he looks at these 20 graduates. He loves them, cares for them. And he says to them, you are all going to die. That's what he said. He said, you are all going to die. Someday you're going to die. Now, you might not think you're going to die, and it might be hard for you to imagine that you're going to die. But someday they're going to take you to the cemetery and they're going to lower you down into a hole and throw dirt on your coffin and go back to the church and eat potato salad. He said, now when you were born, you cried and everybody else was happy. But that's not important. He said, here's what's important. When you die, will you be happy and will everyone else around you be crying? He said, well, it will depend upon what you're living for now, won't it? Are you living for titles or testimonies? Titles or testimonies? And he kept repeating that phrase, titles or testimonies. He said, is that all you're living for? Titles? Just to get titles behind your name? Bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctor's degrees? Are you living for titles or testimonies? And then, boy, black preaching, it's got rhythm and music and poetry, and he's just moving along. And he starts going through the entire Bible. Tony Campolo said, black preachers can go from Genesis to Revelation in 5 minutes. He said, we white men can't do it. He said, we get bogged down everywhere along the way. But he's just preaching through the scriptures, and this black preacher, he says, now Pharaoh had a title. He was the ruler of Egypt. That's a fine title, ruler. But in the end, all he had was a title. But Moses had a testimony. Queen Jezebel, good title there, queen. But she tried to kill Elijah and all God's prophets. And in the end, all Jezebel